Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this edition of MCA Canada's Toolbox Talks. This is a podcast for the Mechanical Contractors Association of Canada. My name is Ken Lascastle, and I'm very pleased to be joined today by two individuals from one of our associate member firms, McMillian LLP. Both Jason Anibale and Jamie Virgin have a wealth of experience in this sector and in our industry. And we're going to be tackling a very important topic today, probably not the only topic we'll get to, but we'll start off at least talking about delay claims. So gentlemen, thanks very much for joining us here today. And Jason, I'm glad I got that name right the first try, not the second or the third. Why don't we just start off a little bit with your background, your experience in the industry, and what you guys do with McMillan. So maybe Jason, I'll start with you.
Sure. First thing, great pronunciation on the last name, Ken. That's what the thumbs up was for. I'd say on behalf of both Jamie and I, we're both very pleased to be able to speak to you today and to speak to your members via the podcast. So thank you very much for having us on, and we hope that we provide some valuable information to you and your members as we go through the topic of delay. So I am the national co-chair of McMillian LLP for construction. We are a group that consists of about 50 lawyers that touch construction in one form or another. Of the 50, I would identify about 25 of us who are hardcore construction and or P3 lawyers. A great deal of my practice is centered in the P3 area, although we do represent clients at all positions within the construction pyramid, whether they're mechanical contractors, whether they're trades, whether they're general contractors, authorities, owners, project co-entities, and lenders. We do all of that. I am a litigator, but I don't like it when people call me a litigator. I do perceive of myself as a construction lawyer. But the reality is I am a dispute resolution lawyer. So I'm often brought in as parties are trying to resolve an issue that is contentious. I spend most of my time in arbitration rooms as opposed to the courtroom because most sophisticated construction contracts that we deal with provide for arbitration. And so my gowns, which we wear in court, are collecting dust. Jamie?
Thanks, Jason. My experience is largely the same as Jason's, with the exception that I'm located in Vancouver, where Jason's in Toronto. And I echo all of the points that Jason said. Construction lawyer first, and dispute lawyer second. Of course, given the background, it does lead us to periodically appear before decision makers to help solve the thorny issues in construction.
Now, I think I always like to preface these conversations when it comes to discussions with legal professionals. We always like to say nothing that we say today constitutes legal advice. And any specific issues that somebody may have who's listening, you guys, and we would encourage them to raise that with their own legal team. So I like to get that out of the way. I don't think there's any issues on that because I don't think any one of us wants to be heading to a courtroom because of this conversation. So
not unless it's a client who is called and we're assisting them.
Right. Then you can pull the gown out of the closet.
That's right.
Well, let's get started on, we came here to talk about delay claims, so let's start with that. And I know just based on our conversations that it wouldn't be unheard of if we start talking about other issues in the industry as well. But I guess right off the bat, let's all get on the same page here, set the record straight. What is delay and what are the causes of delay? And maybe Jason, I'll turn that one over to you.
Sure. Delay is not a new phenomenon. It has existed since construction existed. It was an issue that no doubt faced those that built the pyramids. At its heart, it's easy to understand in terms of it is some sort of event that impacts the schedule of construction in one form or another. Delay events that impact construction that aren't connected to the critical path doesn't really matter so much. It's events that impact the critical path that matter. What's the critical path? It is the line of events in a construction project that, if delayed, will impact the final completion date. Now, at the level of theory, again, not overly complicated. If you're building, for example, a deck in your backyard, and you're not able to get to the store to buy the plywood because the store's closed for a day. Well, that's easy enough. You've been delayed a day because the store was closed in a very straightforward construction project. But the kind of delay that we deal with, while conceptually is the same, it's on very sophisticated, complex construction sites where there are literally thousands of activities that are being performed at any moment. And so assessing what is truly a delay that impacts the critical path can be quite a challenge. And indeed, Ken, you've heard me call it this before, and Jamie, many times you've heard me call it, but trying to understand and map out delay can sometimes be like the intersection between black magic and science. No doubt there is science to it in terms of understanding the sequencing of activities on a construction site, but high levels of creativity can also come to inform the analysis. Examples of delay: unforeseen site conditions. We thought the site wasn't going to have an Aboriginal burial ground within it. As we started construction, what do you know? We found one. Well, that's going to impact the completion date. We need to deal with that, call the coroner or the local First Nation community to come in and deal with that. That's going to impact the schedule of construction. Severe weather conditions that are not normal to a particular area. That's something that can delay construction. So if you have a snowfall in Toronto, doesn't typically delay construction. If you have a snowfall in like Tampa, that might, right? So it has to be weather conditions that are totally unexpected. Inability to access the construction site. That would be another element of delay. The owners fenced it off and not let the general contractor or a trade come in and work on it. Design changes is another common one. That is, we want to change the way that this aspect of the hospital functions to do the following things instead of what was initially prescribed. That is another element of delay. And I could go on and list a myriad of others.
Yeah, and I mean, you touched on that point early on where you say this is not a new issue, and I think anybody in the industry who's listening to this, whether it be the deck builder all the way to those more complex projects, understands that stuff happens and inevitably will impact the time and the scheduling that you've afforded that project. So obviously not a new issue. So why now? I mean, Jamie, I'll ask you, why now is this a more troublesome issue, or why are we seeing conversations around delay and delay claims more now?
Yeah, it's a great point, and as Jason said, and you echoed, delay isn't new. The nature of the impacts are not new. It's the magnitude of the impacts that we're experiencing that are really new or unexpected, and that's largely almost 100% attributable to COVID and the pandemic itself. We're seeing issues with disrupted supply chains, site density issues, issues with spending more time donning and doffing PPE. So it's COVID causing greater impacts as opposed to this being a new concept that we're moving slower. Our schedule has been delayed because of a circumstance. Because as Jason pointed out, there's a myriad of causes of delay, and pandemic was one of them. We just never expected to have a pandemic that lasted 2 years and caused the impacts or the magnitude of the impacts that we're experiencing today.
Yeah, I would just add before Ken, you move to the next question. I totally agree with Jamie, and I can't overemphasize the impact that COVID-19 has had on delay impact claims. So Jamie's desk, my desk, and the desk of just about every construction lawyer in Canada is filled with project disruption cases resulting from COVID-19, both real and fake, and combinations of the two. Real because the pandemic has had real effects on construction sites in terms of the safety of workers and making sure that they are safe, labor shortages resulting from fear or actual illness, supply disruption chains, escalation in prices, government stop work orders, all related to, or just owners stopping work. We talked a little bit about that too. All matters that have impacted construction in one form or another. And that has not stopped and has put delay and impact claims at the forefront of construction in the construction industry today. It is one of the largest, if not the largest issue that we have been facing over the last 2 years.
One of the thorny issues, and you raise a really good point, Jason, and it's something we identified very early on in the pandemic, was the fact of the pandemic certainly falls within many force majeure provisions, but the consequences don't always, and sometimes there's discretionary decisions either by the owner or the contractor to reduce site density, perhaps because it makes good health and safety sense, but not necessarily as a result of a direction from a government or otherwise. So part of our job is to help separate, okay, is this an effect or an impact caused by the pandemic, or is there some other intervening event or decision that has inserted itself? So that's where Jason gets to the point about being real or otherwise, and it makes this type of delay particularly thorny to untangle.
Yeah, and I think, we've talked in the past about how the risk allocation in a contract tends to move that risk down the line. So trade contractors in particular are impacted by these delays. And then, there's this twofold risk. There's the risk of the delay and the additional cost that a delay would have for a trade contractor, whoever's performing the work. But then there's that risk of the claim. So why are we finding now that claims have become a greater risk than before? Or are we just seeing more of them as a result of the pandemic and the issues because of the pandemic?
Well, that's a great question. Are there more claims now? I think that there are more delay and impact claims now. Certainly, I see a lot more in my practice, and I think they are the result of COVID-19. So I think there has been an increase in claims. There's been an increase in other things too, at least at certain points within the pandemic, an increased collaboration amongst parties as they move to solve the problems that COVID-19 causes. But before we get into those things, I wanted to go back a little bit on the risk allocation portion of the question that you raised, Ken. And it might be helpful for those listening to understand that with different kinds of delay, parties often account for risk differently. So one key kind of delay is owner cost. And typically within contracts, including the CCA1, what happens with owner cost delay, the contractor and those down the line are entitled to time and money as a result of the owner having delayed. There are also government impacts or stop work orders that traditionally have been understood to be the fault of the owner. And in those circumstances, again, thinking specifically about CCDC contracts, the risk allocation there is, again, the contractor or the trade is entitled to time and money on that theory that the government stop order was the result of the owner. We see with COVID-19, not necessarily the case. And then the third is force majeure, which is a term that Jamie already raised. You can barely talk about COVID-19 without mentioning force majeure. I don't think force majeure was really mentioned all that much for decades, but now it's all that people can talk about, and by definition it is an unforeseeable event, as between the contact parties or amongst the contract parties, that neither of them or none of them caused. So conceptually that's what it is, but understand this: it doesn't exist in the air. So force majeure is something that is stipulated in your contract or not, and so if you have a force majeure provision, it often lists certain items, could list a pandemic, could list an epidemic, often did not traditionally, definitely does now, or often does now. but strikes, acts of God, war, those sorts of things. And then within a CCDC contract, there was this bucket clause that also said any other unforeseeable event not caused by either the owner or the contractor. And in that circumstance, the received wisdom, traditionally, your contractor, your trade, would get time, but no money. And that's because neither of the parties were responsible for the loss. And so they were trying to achieve a fair result. And in the absence of COVID-19, that was a very fair allocation of risk. With COVID, it has caused parties to reevaluate that risk and consider, because of the actual increased cost of a COVID-19 event, a pandemic, allowing for just time in the absence of money is unfair. So that's how it goes in terms of delays that are caused by forces outside of the contract or the trade. If the trade, and this is to your point about claims, if the trade has caused a delay or the contractor, they're responsible for the losses that the owner or those higher up in the chain may suffer as a result of that delay, that failure to meet substantial completion or completion. And again, this is presuming a delay to the actual critical path. If we haven't delayed the critical path, then it's not delay that really matters. But in that circumstance, what you often see in contracts is a liquidated damages clause. That is, parties don't trouble themselves to actually add up their losses in the event of a delay. They provide a genuine pre-estimate of what those damages are, and then calculate that on a daily basis. And if it's found that the trade or the contractor has delayed by virtue of its conduct the completion date, then they'll be on the hook for liquidated damages in the way that I've described, subject to any limitations of liability that sit in the clause. Now, I said a lot, but I did because your question demanded it. And Jamie has a fair bit to say in response too.
As usual. No, you raised some really good points, and your question, Ken, really triggered off of what I might call a reevaluation of risk or reconsideration of risk, because no one, as we talked about at the start, no one really expected the magnitude of the impacts. Some of our contracts did contemplate pandemics, some didn't, as Jason points out, but no one expected to have the magnitude of the impacts that we're now experiencing. And the best example, or one of the best examples, is in respect of the increased transportation costs. So typically in most of our contracts that we see, the trade responsible for delivering the material and the other components to site would be responsible for increased costs associated with that. No one disputes, or very few people would dispute, that COVID has materially increased the cost of transportation of materials to site, but our contracts haven't always fairly allocated that risk that we're seeing now today. So I think what parties are doing now is, one, they're building an evaluation into their contracts and ways to mitigate some of the increased costs that we're seeing as a result of COVID. And two, where our contracts weren't dealing with it, parties are coming together and collaborating a little bit more, or at least trying to collaborate more, because everyone in the construction chain, or most parties in the construction chain, realize that this is something that needs to be dealt with. Decision makers are also realizing that, look, at our contracts perhaps didn't deal with the risk allocation for this event in the way that we may have expected, which brings us to just having a conversation about it and trying to, as Jason said, collaborate and reevaluate that risk allocation.
Yeah, and it's interesting because we've talked about this force majeure clause, and as you say, it's one of those clauses now people look for. Probably it's one of it's when you open it up and you say, where is it? I want to make sure it's in there. But seems like it's one of the first times that we've had this, because I've seen in the past, prior to COVID-19, force majeure referencing a pandemic or an epidemic, but there was no, I guess, practice or way to perceive how much a pandemic would affect other things. So when you talk about the time, that delay and allocating the time, but not the money, that piece just wasn't perceived prior to the pandemic. And we now know just how far COVID has affected all aspects of our, of the supply chain, the PPE, the productivity, all these different pieces that we probably couldn't have perceived prior to actually living through this at this point. Whereas a tornado, it's a little bit easier to say, yeah, it's going to cause some delays on the site, but not necessarily the additional costs associated with the price volatility and supply chain issues and transportation costs, as you refer to there, Jamie. So that's certainly an interesting point, and something I think we should take away from this is, being aware of what your contract says with respect to some of these things, because it does allocate that risk on that delay piece. And, our members should be taking a look at their contracts and understanding how it allocates that risk appropriately. I had a question for you, Jason, because when I was listening to you, when you're talking about those different types of delays, are we referring to at that point the difference between an excusable or a non-excusable delay? Is that where that sits, or is that something completely different?
Yes, it is. So conceptually, people talk about compensable and non-compensable delays, and excusable and non-excusable, right? So an excusable, and it's from the perspective of the contractor or the trade. So excusable delay is something like, well, the owner caused the delay, right? Or there was this government stop work order, and so I was delayed. That's excusable, right? The question then comes in, well, is it also compensable? So excusable means you're going to get time. Compensable or non-compensable, that deals with money. Will you get money? So in the event of an owner caused delay, for example, or government stop work order, the traditional wisdom is yes, those are also compensable for your contractor or trade. Not so with force majeure, traditionally, where it's excusable but non-compensable in that way. And then obviously a delay caused by the trade or the contractor would be neither compensable nor excusable.
So when we're talking about delays and delay claims, and I know in our conversations in the past, you've both made this point, how important it is to understand what's in your contract. Can you talk a little bit about some of the key items that trade contractors should be aware of within their contract when it comes to delays and delay claims?
Yeah, absolutely. I can field that one to start, and I'm sure Jason will have a few follow-up comments.
Yeah, I might do a couple of things to say.
I can say that prior to the start of the pandemic, parties were aware of their contracts, but not always following them in the same way that we're seeing now. And this is, we're finding particularly important for trade contractors in following their notice provisions, taking a look at the contract, determining first who they need to write to when they're experiencing a delay or they're noticing a delay on site, describing accurately and clearly what that delay is all about, and to the extent they can at that point, quantify or describe the nature of the impacts they're experiencing. So really it comes down to the fundamental point of reading the contract, understanding your contract, and then following the terms to a T as best you can. You can be legally, as a lot of parties are finding out, you can be legally barred from making a claim for a delay if you don't send your notice in time. So if you don't have all the information, send the notice, let the owner know or let the general contractor know that you're experiencing a delay, what you understand the delay to be, and then open up that dialogue. And some of the advice that I know both Jason and I give is that once you've written a letter and sent your general contractor notice, pick up the phone and have a conversation about it, because you can usually solve the problem before it creates something bigger. But ultimately it's ensuring that the requirements of the contract are met.
And just on that point, what is your message? I think you've kind of already answered it, so I might just have you repeat it again, but what is your message to a contractor who may be hesitant about putting a notice or using those notice provisions because of the relationships or that feeling that it might it might hurt them in the long run. I think when you reference picking up the phone, I think that's part of your answer, but maybe we want to reiterate that a little bit as well.
No, you're absolutely right. I foreshadowed the answer to that question. It's really construction is about relationships, right? We're in the relationship business, and it's not just about building the project that we're working on, but we're thinking about the next project too. And so I always encourage clients to pick up the phone, have a conversation either before or after. Sometimes it's as simple as saying to the other side, look, you're going to receive a delay notice from me. I have to send it because our contract requires it, but let's have a conversation. Let's see if we can come up with a solution to this where everyone's happy. And 9 times out of 10 that works because it preserves the relationship. It lets the other side know that, look, at you're following the terms of the contract because you have to, but you're not intending to escalate it into a dispute.
That's such important advice. Again, can't be overemphasized, where you may very well prejudice yourself and your ability to forward a claim if you've not provided notice within the requisite time and in terms of the substance of the notice. And so many trades, so many contractors hold on delivering those notices because of the relationship issue. And Jamie, you've outlined, couching it in the right way to protect your claim and at the same time protect the relationship is really the way to go. And as you go forward in the way that you've described, Jamie, you often resolve the matter at the front end because you've encouraged that level of communication that your contract has told you to do. I wanted to have a go at your question too, Ken, and identify a couple of the other clauses within a contract that mechanical contractors, trades, and contractors generally should be mindful of. So we talked about many of the important ones already. The delay provisions, right? The notice provisions. But there are some others. Suspension and termination. So a couple of the larger cases on my desk have to do with suspension and termination clauses in a number of ways, but the way that I'm thinking of specifically is there are some contracts that will say after a 30-day period of delay, the contract automatically terminates. Now, that's not within the CCDCs. I think that there is it doesn't happen automatically, but a party's right is generated to terminate that contract after a period of delay. But some automatically terminate on top of it. Watch that, because if it automatically terminates, you've got to renegotiate your contract. Now, it could be as simple as renegotiating on the basis of, yeah, okay, let's just put the same contract into effect, but not necessarily. Now, the clause makes some good sense at the level of theory because the risk profile of the project's now changed, right? You're delayed a certain number of days. It's now changed. So you want to trigger a right for someone to pull out or renegotiate, right? That makes sense. But just have an eye to it because, many of the government stop work orders exceeded the prescribed period within contracts. And some people, not having read it, were taken by surprise. So you see the theme, read your contract, read your contract. I mean, this is the stuff that we talk about all the time. And so many people in the construction industry still don't, because it is a relationship business too. And in trusting the relationship, sometimes they don't look at the contract. But there was one point that we didn't raise in our practice session that I wanted to raise here. And that is in many contracts, subcontracts, it also says all the terms and conditions that bind the contractor in its contract with the owner, well, they bind the trade. I don't know if I've ever seen a case where the trade has actually read that contract. And when they seek it, sometimes the contractor withholds it, right? Like it's unbelievable. And do not tolerate that sort of conduct. If it is a contract document that you need to look at, and you're bound by it, then you make sure that you get a chance to take a look at. Otherwise, you'll be into the fight of, well, you withheld it, and so therefore it doesn't bind us. You don't want to get into that. It's better to be just open about it at the front end. Change in law. So this is the back door when for COVID claims. And what do I mean by that? Well, because COVID sometimes in some contracts is perceived as a force majeure, where you get time but not money, if you are able to characterize the increased guidelines, maybe laws that COVID constitute, and turn that into a change in law, there are change in law provisions that allow you to get money. So what doesn't come through the front door of a force majeure clause may very well come through the back door of a change in law. Be careful here, though, because Justice Conan in the Mobile Links decision did characterize certain guidelines that were issued by the government as not necessarily law. So the ability to forward that argument, at least in Ontario, may be severely hampered, but not so hampered that I would avoid making the point here on this podcast.
It's a great point, Jason, and really it comes back to what we talked about at the top of the show, and that was really what was the true cause of the delay or the impact that you're experiencing, and then the claim that you're making. So it's really about grounding your claim in the contract and the correct provisions, as Jason points out, and then making an assessment as to what you need to do in order to follow that, because sometimes notice is different depending on the provision that you're grounding your claim in. But it really also drives home the point that you touched on, Ken, earlier about sometimes you have a basket clause, or your force majeure is very broadly described. So you have a tornado, and I think most people conceptualized force majeure in the way you did. It's a tornado, it rips through the site, there's some cleanup and the site shut down for 2 weeks, but you can get back to work after you've done your cleanup. Pandemic, not so. We have lasting impacts that last 4 years, and does it make sense that a party should only be entitled to time as a result of the pandemic, or should there be some other compensation afforded? So it's really looking at what the impacts that you're claiming, and there might be aspects of it that were directly attributed to the pandemic. And there also might be, as Jason points out, some aspects that are change of law. So yes, was the change of law a result of the pandemic? I don't think anyone would argue that, but your contract affords you different avenues to make different types of claims that all fall under the rubric of somehow related to the pandemic.
This speaks to, I think, another issue that we've talked about in the past, and that's the importance of your record keeping and your awareness of not just what causes the delay, but the costs of that delay. Your scheduling, I guess, for the contractor, what would you say to them in terms of that? How important is it? How important is project records and being aware of scheduling changes and just keeping track of, and those, we talked a little bit about the notices as well, but just having that record of the project, and how important of a role does that play in the claim process, but just dealing with delays as well?
Jamie, I'll have a go at it first, and then Jamie, you can fill in the blanks or correct me where I get it wrong. Ken, your question anticipates the answer. It's vital. It is absolutely vital.
You see how I do that, though? I just here's the answer I'd like.
Good cross-examination technique. But yeah, I would resist it if the premise was wrong, but it's not. It's absolutely vital. Construction claims are document intensive. And I see the eyes of arbitrators roll over when people make claims that aren't in writing somewhere. They just don't care so often. Making sure that your claim history is properly documented in a professional, more on that in a second, in a professional manner is absolutely key. So as you send a text, and don't, but so many people on the construction site do use texting as a form of communication. Really, I would discourage that unless you're just talking about, heading to the bar after work, which is perfectly fine. But if it's at all work related, it needs to be in email is what I would characterize as perhaps the best practice, but certainly texting would not be a good one. And you wouldn't want to say anything in respect of work that you wouldn't mind an arbitrator or a judge reviewing. So that's the point on document hygiene. And we're talking about claim documents right now, but in terms of schedule, it is so important to have a functioning, working schedule that is updated regularly. So in your more sophisticated construction companies, you might have internal personnel that are actually schedulers. They're project managers or engineers or both that are trained in using particular software to track changes, delay impacts, et cetera, and indeed map out what the schedule of the project is going to be. But even if you're not an organization that has that, you do need to have a responsible person for tracking delay impacts in one form or another, even if it's in more rudimentary form, like identifying the impact in the number of calendar days that you were halted and keeping a detailed record of that, even if you're not using Primavera, for example, would be an incredibly important thing to do. Jamie?
Those are all fantastic points, Jason. I'll park document hygiene for a moment and talk about one aspect that you raised, and that's ensuring that your schedule, whether it's in Primavera or otherwise, is up to date, and you're recording all of the delay events. But equally important, especially on large infrastructure projects, is ensuring that your schedule narratives are clear and up to date, because those can be used by arbitrators and other decision makers to really inform what the schedule is showing. So it's ensuring that your monthly reports or your weekly reports or whatever type of reporting that you're doing up the construction pyramid has a accurate written reflection of what's happening on site. And then on the topic of records, it's ensuring that you're keeping your receipts, you're keeping all of the information, you're keeping the hours and the hours logged to be able to provide that so you can make your claim, because as Jason said, it's vitally important that you're having an accurate record of what's going on at site. Now that's when you're the trade. Now I think those up the construction pyramid also need to have realize that not every bottle of hand sanitizer is going to be recorded, and there needs to be some reasonability into it. And again, I don't want to contradict ourselves, because we do need to follow the contract, but there also needs to be a bit of reasonability and collaboration in the discussion about what needs to be recorded in order to prove that you have in fact suffered an impact as a result of the delay. One of the difficulties with delay claims is that documenting them is intensive and takes away from your time working on the project, and it almost becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because you're spending so much time documenting the delay and the impacts that you're not working, or you're not able to devote all your resources towards the work, and you end up experiencing further productivity or delay impacts. So it's tricky to navigate sometimes.
Sometimes you can open up a specific number, like a claim number, tracing the delays for a specific item. One thing that we haven't talked about yet is photographs and video. So incredibly powerful and increasingly used in delay claims that we see. That is showing a collection of photographs that become animated by way of a video over time. Or actual video of the construction site. Very, very powerful tools and persuasive tools in showing what the actual status of the site was, what it was, and at what time. So very important. And what you can see underlying all of these comments is delay impacts need to be evidenced in some way. So there is a causal connection between the project delay and the activity that you're talking about. You have to establish that on evidence. No one's just going to believe you, or you might be believed if you're incredibly persuasive, but it's poor evidence to just stand up and make the claim in the absence of persuasive evidence through the documentation, through photographs, through video, showing the actual delay that occurred. And contemporaneous, writing a report a year later to try and buttress what you're now creatively thinking about doing. No.
The photographs, the records, I mean, does this speak to it feels as though this speaks to a duty to mitigate on behalf of the contractor, to mitigate the delay. Like you're doing the work, but you are keeping track of it to illustrate and to have that piece to say, look, this is actually causing a significant delay, and this is how it's impacting my work. Am I off base there, or is that?
It's a good concept to introduce, that is mitigation, but we were speaking of it in terms of just evidencing the actual delay.
Okay.
Evidencing your efforts in mitigating, though, is also important, and it's good that you're introducing the idea that is, if you suffered a delay impact, whether you're a contractor or whether you're a subtrade, you can't just say I've been delayed and just let it all unfold. You have an obligation to mitigate, that is, minimize the impact of the loss that you're facing to a reasonable extent. Often that's within contracts, a reasonable obligation to mitigate. But at common law, that is, in the absence of contract, parties have an obligation to reasonably mitigate. What does that mean? It means that if there is a reasonable cost to limiting what would otherwise be a much larger cost in allowing the delay in this case to unfold, then that's a cost that you should take on. A cost for which you can be compensated for in actually mitigating. Jamie, further on that, or?
It's a great point. And Ken, the tie-in is correct in that you need to evidence it at the end of the day. You may be taking these steps to mitigate, but if you have no way of proving it, or you try to a year later say, oh, well, I was mitigating this delay and here's all of the great things I did, it's not contemporaneous. It's going to be very difficult to show those mitigation efforts and then therefore make a claim for it. Mitigation is built into really all of the contracts, most all contracts that you see. And if it's not in the contract, as Jason said, it's at common law, but really it comes down to having the proof that you actually did it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, what I take away from a lot of this and a lot of these conversations is just how important, as you say, the text message is not going to do the trick. It should be, as you say, it's you following your proper notice provisions and using the communications tools that you have at your disposal, but keeping good records and keeping track of everything that's gone on. So we've reached this claim stage, let's call it. Can we talk a little bit about the role of expert evidence at that stage and how that fits into all this?
Sure, I'll go first. So expert evidence at its heart is evidence that is pro-offered, opinion evidence that's pro-offered by a subject matter expert that a lay person just doesn't have access to that information. And their job is to impartially assist the decision maker in making the right choice. So the expert is not to usurp the role of the decision maker and take on the role of making a decision themselves. It is to assist the decision maker in doing that. And what I've said, week-long seminars have been done on just the little bit that I've said there. But having said that, a delay expert, a scheduling expert, is someone who has that expertise, that knowledge in understanding how to map out activities on a construction site and to record delay impacts. Some people might argue that it actually is not a real expertise. That is, it's just fact-based, and if you follow the chain of activities, you can do it. I mean, good luck to you, really, if you think that you're that capable. But I think it is an absolutely legitimate and vital part of dealing with a delay claim. That is to have a good expert supporting you. What so often happens, so I talked about the expert's obligation to tell the truth, and their duty is really to the decision maker and not specifically to the client when it comes to telling the truth. So they can't take on the role of an advocate, which is my job, which is Jamie's job, that is to advocate within the confines of the law and our ethical duties to present a persuasive case for our client. An expert is different, where they might have a duty of loyalty to their client in a business sense, but their duty in terms of telling the truth is to the decision maker. There are different methodologies that experts can bring to bear as they tell their story on different techniques. So sometimes experts, as they're dueling, it's not an apples to apples comparison, and working that out becomes a challenge. Within the realm of delay, as I signaled earlier on in discussion, intersection between science and black magic, I would say it's a particular challenge. So it is a particular challenge when you have, you often have dueling experts. One says 200 days of delay is the contractor's fault. The other, wouldn't you know it, says 200 days of delay is the owner's fault. So often that happens in the context of construction. So often that decision makers lose their patience. And guess what? They hire their own delay experts. So now we have three, right, that are going at it. And so, you know, Jamie and I have spent a great deal of time talking about this technique, not used yet, at least I haven't in my practice yet. I don't think Jamie has yet either, where, you know, parties, if they can overcome the discomfort of not having their own delay expert that they can speak to, have a delay expert arbitrate the issue of delay on the basis of submissions provided by both parties. So instead of a nightmare scenario of like 3 delay experts, you have one. There are other techniques to overcome dueling experts. I'll let Jamie speak about it, hot tubbing and other items. We'll want to get into it. Hot tub process.
Yeah, the hot tub process sounds odd, but it really just comes down to what Jason's point is, that decision makers, because there are so many differing views about how you measure delay, how you determine what was the cause of the delay based on the same fact pattern. Decision makers often ask the parties to come to have their experts come together and sit down. They call it hot tubbing, but really what it means is the experts sit down together, usually in the absence of the parties and the decision maker, to arrive at the questions that should be asked of them and potentially even arrive at the answers. They don't always agree on what those answers are, but it allows the decision maker to, as best they can, compare apples to apples as opposed to apples to oranges, because of the nature of opinion evidence in respect of delay. You can find yourself in a situation where you're not comparing apples to apples, and then it makes the decision maker's job that much harder. And then, as Jason said, they may decide to go get their own expert to determine what questions they need to be answering and how they're answered. So we're seeing, especially in the dispute resolution side, a whole bunch of different ways to deal with delay and use opinion evidence to help with that. And then, as Jason pointed out, one such way is to have the delay expert decide the result. And there's some commercial and intellectual appeal to that, because we of course have consultants do these decisions often on payment disputes throughout the project. So I certainly see the intellectual appeal to it. The advocate in me obviously would like to to have more say in the process. But the other point that I wanted to make with respect to experts, and Jason's brain, like mine, goes to the what I'd call the forensic analysis of scheduling, and the once you're in the dispute, you're engaging the expert. But it's also important to remember that you can engage experts earlier on. Oftentimes they're in-house. You may have a scheduler in-house that can help you understand schedule, and that imparts a level of expertise and opinion that's important to have up front to help potentially avoid disputes. And then once you get further into building your project, you may even engage an expert to help you build your claim and understand your claim and articulate your claim when you're presenting it to the other side. So as much as Jason and I divert to the forensic analysis of schedules, experts can play an important role throughout the process, right, from the beginning all the way through to the end.
That's an excellent point. I wanted to make a point on retaining delay experts too. Retain them early, as Jamie has said, but when retaining, you need to be careful and mindful of business conflicts to ensure that your expert is not actually working for your adversary on the same project. So Jamie and I have had the misfortune of having to deal with a circumstance where we had a delay expert that was most aggressive in its understanding of what's a conflict and what isn't, to the detriment of the client that we represented. So the days of approaching an expert and giving them the names of the parties and letting them run their own conflict search, don't do it. Have very pointed questions about who they are working for in respect of the project, whether they've ever touched the project. You should have your lawyers, your counsel, ask specific detailed questions to get at whether or not there actually is a conflict, so your lawyer can make the assessment.
Yeah, that sounds like a very good piece of advice to take away from all this. And that's just, being aware of who you're getting in the hot tub with, so to speak.
That's right.
You're a quick study, Ken.
Brings it all together, doesn't he?
Right? It's cold here, guys. I don't want to take too much more of your time, and I want to have more conversations with you guys in the future about a lot of different issues. One of the things I wanted to ask about that I think it might be a bit of a trick question. It's the first time I've asked this of you guys, but what do you do in the absence of a fixed schedule on a construction contract, and how does that affect delay? Is time just doesn't exist in that situation, or what happens there?
It's an easy question. If you don't have a specific schedule with a specific completion date, you just need to complete it within a reasonable time. And that's a mess, right? So that is the default. That is, if you haven't prescribed time, the idea is that the parties set it to be done within a reasonable time. And I can tell you, no one's going to agree on what that is, and you're going to have a decision maker at the end of the day deal with it. But the way you phrased your question made me think of something called the prevention principle. And that's something that Jamie and I had to deal with in most contentious arbitration in Vancouver. The other side, in our view, wrongly raised the issue, and indeed in the view of the arbitrators, wrongly raised the issue. But the prevention principle is engaged in a circumstance where you have a contract. Let's just deal with owner contractor to make it simple, where your owner says every single delay under the sun, contractor, you're responsible for. Doesn't matter what it is. And your contractor just wants the job. So off he goes, and he, she, they sign it. And lo and behold, it's the owner itself that delays the job. And in that circumstance, the prevention principle comes to the aid of the contractor to say, no, you're not liable for those delays. And it comes into play specifically when you've got, it comes into that delay into play in that circumstance, but where you have a liquidated damages clause, right? So in the contract where the owner is seeking to rely on that liquidated damages clause for the very conduct that the owner engaged in, the liquidated damages clause is held null and void. So it is no longer enforceable, and both time and damages for delay are at large. And you end up in a circumstance where in your contract, you had liquidated damages and you had a completion date, and both those things get evaporated by virtue of the prevention principle, which is a common law principle that comes into play where you have an owner that's overreaching and trying to put your contractor on the hook for every single delay. Now, how many contracts do you see like that? Not many. I don't know that it comes into play a lot, because usually there is an escape valve where the owner quite rightly says, no, if there are delays that I've caused, I'm on the hook for them. And owners, you need that clause. Otherwise, the prevention principle becomes engaged.
Right.
Jamie, further to add?
No, I think you raised some fantastic points, and it's really, as you can probably tell, Engage is a very interesting issue that there's a lot of academic debate on. But as Jason said earlier, there's not a lot of court decisions really in respect of construction because they're being dealt with in arbitration. And in this particular issue, there's not a lot of case law on it. So it's something that we like to debate and don't know all the answers to, because they haven't been written somewhere, or at least that are accessible to everybody.
and not for like 60, 70 years. I'd have to do the calculation. I think it's like 1940s case on prevention principle. Does that get at the answer you were looking for, Ken, or were you?
Yeah, it doesn't. I mean, it brings up that other issue of case law and arbitration that we've talked about, and you guys have both mentioned, and it's the absence of case law because of arbitration, rightly or wrongly, or bad grammar here, but goodly or badly. And having that absence of case law and things to look to on how these have been managed, because they do generally get resolved prior to litigation at arbitration. I guess from my perspective, and for those listening, I would want to ask you guys, what is your hope a contractor would take from this discussion and what we've talked about today? And is there anything else that we haven't touched on that you think is sort of fundamental to the topic?
Yeah, I can have a go at it, and I'm sure Jason will have some follow-up comments, but I think the take-home points for me are really, first of all, read your contract, make sure you understand your contract, ensure that you follow the provisions, whether you're claiming delay or some other impact. The second point for me is that because construction is relationship driven, is pick up the phone and have a conversation with your customer that you're working with, or the owner. It's so important to have these conversations, have these discussions, and potentially resolve a dispute before you need to call me or Jason.
That's right, Jamie. Your contract is your opportunity to create the relationship that you want and allocate risk in the way that you think is appropriate in the circumstances. So seize that opportunity and understand what you've done in the contract by reading it. Precise, realistic, and current schedules. I hope that viewers will take that away as something that's important. A pristine, clear, and professional document trail and record, particularly when it comes to claims. Designated responsible project personnel. High rates of turnover often encourage a failed project or a troubled project. So if there is turnover, make sure that it's being managed appropriately and you have personnel that are engaged. That might be a new point that I'm raising, but it's a best tips that I'm going with. And then the other thing, which Jamie's done a very good job of thematically meshing what I'm about to say into all of his comments, and that is bring a spirit of collaboration and innovation to your work. Because we're very much of the view that the construction industry, and perhaps every industry, is best when it's engaged in a collaborative, innovative spirit. And that does happen. We do see it. Even as litigators, we have the joy of servicing very, very good clients that are geared in that direction and want to create a successful project with successful relationships many times over. And so, while certainly you need to be careful in the ways that we've described and keep your head up because you'll get it knocked off if it's not up, don't do that at the risk of engaging in that spirit that we're talking about.
Gentlemen, I think that's a good place to leave it. And maybe next time we get together, we can talk about the future of collaborative contracting and the role that trade contractors play within that ecosystem. But I do want to thank you both for taking the time today and speaking with me on this topic. I know I've learned a lot, and I know there's a wealth of information that you guys have available. So I'll ensure that your contact information is circulated when we share this as well. And I appreciate you both being with me today. I've got Vancouver, Toronto, and Ottawa, so we're doing pretty good well covering the country here today. So I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Ken.
Thank you, Ken.
I'm most grateful for the time.
Yeah, we'll look forward to doing it again soon.
Thanks so much.
Yeah. And that's